Good afternoon. We extend to you a warm welcome from Provo, Utah. I'm Sister Esplin and will be the host for today's class. Today's class is offered to the general public by the BYU Family History Library. Questions related specifically to the family history work of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints should be addressed on an individual basis with one of our missionaries, either in person or virtually. Our presenter today is Sister Erika Ward. She has a love of learning and an extensive background in family history and genealogical research. She is currently working on a master's degree from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. We hope you will find your time with us productive and enjoyable. I'll now turn the time over to Sister Ward.
Today's presentation is the last in a four-part series on Scottish research. And our topic today is when and where did my Scottish ancestors move? Understanding Scottish Immigration and Emigration records. Parts 1, 2, and 3 were presented in July and were recorded. Previous topics that we covered were UK geography, Scottish census records, church records, old parish records, and Scottish civil records. If you'd like to watch any of those, you can find them on the BYU Family History Library YouTube channel, as well as in our classes archive on the BYU Family History website. I've listed these links in the handout, which you will also be able to find on our website with this recording in a couple days, besides being in the chat there. All right, so by way of introduction, my name is Erika Ward, and I'm happy to be with you today. I've been a genealogist since I was a small child, thanks to very early childhood introduction by my mom right here. You can see her there. Trying to get this to go on the screen. And she's been gone since 2007, so I think of her nearly every time I'm researching. This is a picture of my husband and I with our 7 children and their families this past April 2022. We love having our 6 cute little grandkiddos and are excited to have another one coming in early 2023. So my posterity is a big motivator for me to work on my own family history records, and I'm hoping to leave them with an organized set of records, files, and sources rather than the jumbled mass that currently takes up a large space in my home. My Scottish knowledge background is primarily from my studies at the University of Strathclyde, based in Glasgow, Scotland. I hold a postgraduate certificate in genealogical, paleographic, and heraldic studies. All right, so when I tell people this, I get a lot of questions about what Strathclyde has available. So I'll take just a few minutes to review a bit about the courses they offer. Through their Center for Lifelong Learning, Strathclyde offers 8-week beginner and intermediate genealogy classes online that you can take from the comfort of your home. And these range from beginning family history research to technology, genetic, genealogy, and DNA. These are really helpful for Scottish research, learning all the ins and outs about Scottish research. So if you really want a good overview, I would recommend taking one of these classes. There's also this great book here, Discover Your Scottish Ancestry by Graham Holton and Jack Winch, which is another great resource that I've listed in the handouts. All right, so next up are the more advanced programs offered by Strathclyde. They're structured as a 3-part online master's degree program, and this is the program I've been going through. There's first a PG Cert, which deals with researching in Scotland, England, and Wales. And you get a grounding in the theory and practice of genealogical research, including paleography, which is the study of old handwriting, and heraldry, which relates to the display and study of coats of arms, armorial achievements, rank, and pedigree. The PG DIP is the second part, and it builds on the postgraduate certificate and focuses on social and historical contexts of genealogical work and includes a large academic research project. And I'm starting that diploma this fall. And then the MSc year is the final stage of the master's program and provides the opportunity to research on an individual topic of your choosing, as long as your tutors think it's a good topic. You're going to spend a whole year on it, so it's quite the project. But anyway, if you're interested in any of these courses, feel free to look at their website, which I've linked in the handout, or feel free to reach out to me at my email address, which is also listed there. All right, so today's topic, Scotland, emigration and immigration. And we'll talk about the following. First, we'll start by talking about the phenomenon of immigration and emigration and review key reasons that people moved between countries. Next, we'll look at an overview of the most common places that Scottish immigrants went when they left their homeland. And third, we'll talk a little bit about the international Scottish immigrants and review sources from those countries. And then we'll spend time on Scottish immigration to North America, both Canada and the United States. And lastly, we'll do a quick review of general resources that can continue to help you as you look for your Scottish ancestors across the globe. All right, in part one here, first I want to go over some definitions. So we have emigration versus immigration. What is the difference? So these terms can be confusing, so I thought it'd be useful to review them. The word emigration derives from the Latin word emigro, that means to move out or to depart, whereas the word immigration is derived from the Latin word immigro, that means to move into. So I always think of like im and in to keep track of that in my mind. So to emigrate is to leave one country for another on a voluntary basis for economic, political, or personal reasons. And to immigrate is to enter a foreign country for a permanent or temporary residence. So people moving from one country to another start out as emigrants in the homeland that they're leaving. For example, you emigrate out of Scotland. And then when they enter the new country, they're called immigrants by those in the new country where they have just arrived. For example, they immigrated to the United States. So there's just a few little definitions for you. All right, so I also want to go over some UK geography. We discussed some of this in part one of this course, but understanding this is important as we discuss Scotland immigration and emigration, since some of these records are housed together in the UK emigrant records. Also, you may have people moving from one part of the UK to another, so it's good to be aware of when it would be considered emigrating and when it would be considered just an internal move within the UK. So to start, Great Britain here is the term used to refer to all of Scotland, England, and Wales. And since the 17th century, Wales, which you see here in pink, has been under the control of the English government. For most genealogical intents and purposes, Wales is legal and administratively the same country as England. Most Welsh records will be searched in similar repositories as England. The National Assembly for Wales was established in 1999, and more powers have been given to Wales incrementally since. Scotland, seen here at the top, is a separate nation from England and always has been, although a union exists, which began in 1603 when James VI of Scotland also became James I of England, which was called the Union of the Crowns. Thus, Scotland's sovereign is simultaneously the sovereign of Scotland and England. Matters that affect the whole United Kingdom or have an internal dimension like defense, international relations, economic policy, taxation, and so on are reserved powers and are dealt with by the UK Parliament in Westminster. All right, so the next major term is United Kingdom, which is the term used to refer to all of Great Britain, plus Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland, seen here on the left in green, kind of a brownish green there, is largely self-governing part of the UK and governed by its own assembly. At present, the UK sovereign is Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So then completely separate is the Republic of Ireland, which is in gray down there. And it has been independent since 1922 and has had its present name since 1937. It's not part of the United Kingdom. Then the last term is the British Isles, which usually refers to everything here on this map, plus British dependencies such as the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands. This term generally includes all of Ireland, Northern, which is part of the UK, and the Republic, which is independent. But remember that the term British Isles is a geographical definition, not a legal or administrative one. So as we talk about these immigration and emigration records, you will hear me talk about Great Britain or Britain a lot, and that's referring to England, Scotland, and Wales as a group. And when you say United Kingdom, you're adding in Northern Ireland as well. And British Isles would just be kind of the whole area geographically. All right, so some historical context on immigration. Scotland lost 10 to 47% of its natural population, or they saw 10 to 47% of the natural population increase every decade in the 1800s. But why were people emigrating away from Scotland in such droves during this time? There's many possible reasons that people emigrate, such as religious persecution, convict transportation, or simply wanderlust. Well, when they went abroad with the military or on business or in search of adventure and decided to stay in the new land. The most typical reason, though, is for economic reasons. So fleeing poverty at home has always been noted as one of the main reasons for Scottish emigration. 2/3 of the land is harsh, rocky, ill-drained, swept by rain-bearing winds off the Atlantic and far from the Mediterranean and medieval centers of European travel and culture. Wars and conflicts are another reason people leave their homelands, as we continue to see today. As discussed in previous lectures, Scotland had its share of upheavals over the centuries, and it was sometimes necessary for people to leave their homes in search of peace. Lastly, finding a better life and better jobs abroad. In the 17th century, a new factor drove Scots away from their homes. Schools in the lowland parishes produced a literate population, resulting in 5 universities in a country of under 1 million people. This created a highly educated middle class. In an underdeveloped Scottish economy, however, there was a shortage of middle class jobs. So this caused many Scots to leave for the likes of England, to several of the Baltic states, and to North America. The 19th century presented new opportunities and new destinations. Scots went abroad to Africa as missionaries, explorers, traders. And in the Far East, they conducted business in the ports of China and Japan. And for impoverished Scots, however, Australia and New Zealand were the lands of opportunity. So you can see that they went all over the world. So that can make it a little bit tricky sometimes when you're looking for tracing the roots of your ancestors. All right. So it's critical to understand, because of this, where the Scottish immigrants went, as well as where those coming into Scotland came from. So as you trace your Scottish ancestors, you may find roadblocks that can be solved by knowing the most common emigration paths, which will help you figure out where your Scottish ancestors came from before being in Scotland and where they went afterward. So until about 1855, a number of the emigrants from the Highlands were forced to leave the land because of evictions. In the lowlands, emigration was almost always the outcome of wanting to improve one's living standards. But the eviction of the Highlanders from their homes peaked in the 1840s and 1850s as the Highland economy had collapsed, while the population still rose. When the earnings from kelp production and black cattle dried up, the landlords saw sheep as a more profitable alternative. And the introduction of sheep meant the removal of people. So this was known as the clearances of the Highlands. Combined with the prospect of starvation faced by much of the farming population when the potato crop failed in the late 1830s and again in the late 1840s, emigration seemed the only option for many of them. The poorest Highlanders were evicted, but small farmers who were capable of paying rent were retained. But then the Emigration Act of 1851 made emigration more accessible to the poorest, with the Highlands and Islands Immigration Society set up to manage the process of resettlement. This decline in population caused many to permanently migrate south, although a significant number left for North America. Those affected by these evictions generally refused to move to lowland Scotland. They opted to sail to Canada and settle in places such as Ontario and Nova Scotia, New Scotland, where they could work on the land and continue their style of life. And Canada was actively recruiting people with these types of farming skills. About half of emigrating Scots chose to settle in the United States as well. And by 1850, Scottish immigrants made up a quarter of the population of New Zealand. So in times of economic depression between the wars in the 19th and 20th centuries, there was change from emigration overseas to more migration to other parts of Britain, and mostly to England, particularly after the 1920s. So one's social standing started to affect the decision of where one settled. The largest category was the skilled worker that immigrated from Scotland. And these skilled workers favored emigration to the United States, with middle classes strongly preferring South Africa. The unskilled laborers primarily sailed to Canada and Australia. So understanding the occupations of your ancestors as you find those on census records and other places can help you maybe figure out where they came from, where they went, and so forth, to figure out their migration paths. There's one particular group of British people known as the Scots Irish, or they're also called the Scotch Irish or Ulster Scots, that ended up in the United States, mostly in Pennsylvania. And I want to go over a little bit of theirs because there's a lot of people that are descended from these Scots Irish. Movement across the Irish Sea between Scotland and Ireland had occurred for a long time, but historically, the Scotch-Irish migration unfolded in the early 17th century, when King James I encouraged his Scottish subjects to migrate across the Irish Sea to his Irish domain. When this migration happened, there was a lot of mixed feelings and problems because you had people from different cultures settling in this land. There were economic hard times and in Scotland, and so they left with the promise of a better life in Ireland. However, because of all the different problems, often, though they first settled in Ulster, which is northeast region of Ireland, and became known as the Ulster Scots, there was conflict. So the Irish who were dispossessed from their lands obviously violently resisted the newcomers. And eventually this regional conflict was drawn into the mid-century Civil War that impacted all the people of the British Isles. So these wars were happening, and in addition to physical destruction inflicted by warfare, the Ulster Scots suffered religious persecution and economic hardship. So by the end of the 17th century, many of them were desperate enough to seek migration once again. So between the 1680s and 1815, at least 100,000 Ulster Scots embarked on a new migration across the Atlantic to North America. They were pushed out of Ulster by discrimination by the Anglican Church of Ireland against their Presbyterian religion, and by depression in the linen trade that provided income to so many of them. And there was also a steep increase in land rents driven by an explosion of the population. So Ulster, which had seemed so attractive as a destination earlier in the 17th century, now appeared to more and more Ulster Scots to be a vale of tears. So at this time of suffering, growing suffering in Ulster, a new land of opportunity beckoned in North America. Exploration and settlement of that newest part of the British Empire had grown apace during the 17th century. So by the 1680s, trade between American and Irish ports had expanded, driven by the importation of American flaxseed, so crucial to Ulster linen industry. So as more ships unloaded their cargoes in the Ulster ports, their crews brought glowing reports of the wonders of America. So many of the Ulster Scot migrants or their descendants decided that migration could once again be their salvation. So they moved all along the American coast, but a major flow of them ended up in Pennsylvania. So if you have ancestors that go through Pennsylvania from Scotland, they're very likely to be in this Scots-Irish group. After unloading our American cargoes in Ulster, ship captains filled their vessels with emigrants for the return trip. And as more and more Ulster people traveled to America, encouraging tales continued to spread and more people came. So this was a very important moment of emigration from Scotland to the United States. But not everybody was leaving Scotland. In fact, it had its share of immigrants from other countries. So many came into Scotland and the rest of Britain in search of a better life, and as a result of economic hardship in their own country. So the grass is always greener on the other side, right? For example, immigration from Ireland began in the 1840s as a result of the Great Famine. And although life did improve after the 1840s, as many as 5 million Irish people left their homeland in the period up to the 1920s. Many emigrated to the United States and Canada, while others decided to start a new life in Britain, and Scotland in particular. Then in the period between 1890 and 1914, approximately 4,000 Southern Italians came into Scotland to evade the growing poverty in their country. Between 1891 and 1901, 25% of Scottish immigrants came from Italy. So there's a large descendancy of Italians also in Scotland. The majority of immigrants, however, came mainly from Russia and Poland, and mostly settled in the west of Scotland to work in key industries that had experienced a shortage of workers, such as coal mines, and to train in the armed forces in preparation for the Second World War. Other Eastern European immigrants arrived in Scotland to escape depression in agriculture, Tsarist oppression, and religious persecution. Many of these were Jewish immigrants who arrived in the 1930s as a result of Adolf Hitler's persecution across Germany. The Jewish community in Scotland prospered and made a substantial contribution to Scottish society, particularly in the legal profession. Integration of Jews into Scotland society was such that attempts by the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s to spread anti-Jewish propaganda was largely unsuccessful. So keep in mind that you may have ancestors who list born in Ireland on a census record, born in Scotland on a census record, whose parents or grandparents were actually born in one of these other countries and then had immigrated to Scotland, which then later they came over to the United States or Canada. So it's something to be aware of and to keep your eye open for, especially if the trail dries up in your research, that you may need to look at that they may have come from somewhere else before Scotland. All right, so over this time period of the 18th and 19th centuries, we had all these immigrants moving away from Scotland and others coming into Scotland. And so there's quite a bit of back and forth with all of this. So to keep it straight, let's summarize where the Scottish immigrants ended up and talk about how to find the records of their travel. So there was a permanent colonization in North America by people from the British Isles starting in 1601, permanent colonization in the West Indies by people from the British Isles starting in 1612. And then in the late 18th and 19th centuries, we saw large-scale immigration to Australia and New Zealand. So it's estimated that 10 million people emigrated from the British Isles in the 19th and 20th centuries. So since immigrants from the UK became immigrants in the countries they travel to, in general, you're more likely to find a record of a person after they emigrate in the destination country. So this makes it a little bit more tricky to search immigration records than some of the previous records that we've been able to mostly look for just in Scotland. So I'm going to go over each of these world areas and review some sources available in these countries for finding your Scottish ancestors that had traveled. So these records are divided into two broad types. We've got journeys, records of the journeys that the immigrants made, and records of their lives once settled in the new country, both which can be very fascinating. And remember that if you have family who immigrated to the United States that you're descended from, they might have cousins, aunts, uncles, even siblings who went to some of these other places. So all of this is helpful to know when you're trying to find your family's immigration records and put them all together. So all of the sources I'm going to review are available in the handout, which I dropped in the chat, and you can also find on the classes archives page of the BYU Family History Library, along with the recording of this and lots of other presentations. All right, so West Indies. So the principal European settlers of the Caribbean islands were from British, French, Spanish, and Dutch. This area is also known as the West Indies. British indentured servants were sent to the islands before the mid-17th century. It's estimated that 1.6 million enslaved people post-1660s, mostly from Africa, were also transported from 1640 till 1808 to the West Indies. But in 1808, the trade was abolished. Most British immigrants would have been working at a plantation or been a merchant or an adventurer. The Caribbean Gen Web project is a collection of online databases of records and individual island web pages that can be helpful for searching for Scottish immigrants that went here. Ancestry also has the Caribbean obituary collection, over 11,000 items, which contains recent obituaries from hundreds of newspapers. Family Search has birth, marriage, and death collections for the various islands back to 1739. You also have the Caribbean Family History website, where there are burial records, memorial inscriptions from many of the islands, some slave compensation records, and data on ministers, priests, and clergy for Barbados and on Quakers there. This is a freely available resource, and there's thousands of records available. So this is a great place to look if you suspect that your Scottish, some of your Scottish family went to the West Indies. All right, so next is Australia. Between 1606 and 1770, an estimated 54 European ships from a range of nations made contact with the local inhabitants of what's now called Australia. Many of these ships were merchant ships from the Dutch East Indies Company and included the ships of Abel Tasman, who charted parts of the northwest and south coast of Australia, then known as New Holland. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook from England charted the Australian east coast and claimed it under instruction from King George III, naming the land New South Wales. The coast of Australia, featuring Tasmania as a separate island, was mapped in detail by the English mariners and navigators Bass and Flinders and the French mariner Baudin. European settlement started in New South Wales in 1788 with convict transportation. So estimates put the total number of people transported from Britain between 1788 to 1868 at around 162,000. During this same period, around 900,000 free settlers had arrived. So you had convict transportation as well as free settlers just mass emigrating over to Australia. And until 1901, there were 6 separate colonies in Australia. And that year they became states, and there's a federal capital founded. There are currently 6 states and 2 territories, the Australian Capital Territory and the Northern Territory. Many useful records are created and held at the state or territorial level. And to get the most out of Australian research, it's helpful to know which state, colony, or territory your ancestors may have lived in. But the Australian GenWeb website has resources, databases, and lists of links arranged by state, as well as the National Library of Australia that has a family history website and a wealth of how-to guides, lists of useful websites, plus a great list of links to online databases, many of which are free. Cora Num's CoraWeb, websites for genealogists, lists over 1,000 websites focused on family history research in Australia, including a great set of links to passenger lists of those coming into the country. Family Search's Australia Wiki is a good overview of various resources and how to find them. And the main Family Search website has a number of databases, such as birth, marriage, and death information, Masonic lodge registers, and monumental inscriptions from Sydney. As far as convict transport, there were so many of these that many Scottish prisoners were sent from England. So do remember to search the British trial records at the National Archives in England for Scottish and English transportees. There's also an excellent website created by the New South Wales State Library, which provides advice on researching convict ancestors and links to useful databases. So immigration and emigration to and from Australia was often done by assistance through grants of money towards their fare. So there were free grants of land, payment of bounties to agents who would pay for the immigrants' expenses. So there were societies such as the Highlands and Islands Emigration Society of Scotland that helped almost 5,000 people to emigrate from Western Scotland to Australia between 1852 and 1857. So these records are all available online, and there is a link in the handout to that society's website. New Zealand next was at first governed by New South Wales or Australia and became a separate crown colony in 1840. This colony was divided into 6 provinces until 1876, when the current system of counties and boroughs with an overarching national government was set up. New Zealand citizenship came into existence under the British Nationality and New Zealand Citizenship Act of 1948. So European settlement began in 1790, at first by traders, and then settlement of the country by free and assisted immigrants was encouraged by organizations such as the New Zealand Company and the Otago Association. By 1860, more than 100,000 British, Scottish, and Irish settlers lived throughout New Zealand. Settlement was boosted by the discovery of gold on South Island in 1860. So the New Zealand Gen Web website has lists of resources by region and a general resource page for beginners to New Zealand genealogy. Archives New Zealand holds the National Government Archives and records of government-assisted immigrants that from 1840 to 1888, as well as ships' passenger lists from the 1880s to 1972. They have World War I personnel files with searchable names on their Archway catalog system, and also hold the records of the government-assisted immigrants from 1840 to 88 and ships' passenger lists from 1880s to 1972. The National Library of New Zealand has a section on family history with advice and links to other websites. They also provide the Papers Past online database of digitized newspapers from New Zealand. Ancestry has a few vital records indexes for New Zealand, as well as city and area directories and electoral rolls. Family Search also has a few databases of interest that include probate records, monumental inscription, and civil record indexes, as well as passenger lists. So there are well over 7 million images here where you can search and view these lists for free. The New Zealand Bound website finally has links to online transcriptions of passenger lists. The Port Chalmers link under main ports has much information on the Scottish immigrants in Otago. All right, so North America. People went to North America from Scotland in a number of ways. There was, again, assisted emigration through work as indentured servants or by parishes assisting the poor to emigrate. Just as in Australia, there was convict transportation where people were just rounded up and sent to a remote part of North America to remove them from the British Isles. There was also emigration of children alone, and this was very interesting. So there's records of the Children's Overseas Reception Board, or CORB, that relate to the evacuation of children overseas, especially during the Second World War, as well as general administrative and establishment files, minutes of meetings, and advisory panels. This series includes a small selection of case files of children sent overseas and their escorts. So you might be able to find missing children at times in these kinds of databases. Then there was just regular emigration of individuals and family groups. So some helpful sources for North American immigration is Peter Coldham's Complete Book of Immigrants, which contains 140,000 records of people who emigrated from England and Scotland to America, either through bondage or freely. It's available in book form in a number of volumes that can be purchased individually, and a database of this same information is available on Ancestry. Dr. David Dobson is a really important name to remember. He published many, many books that include lists of Scots abroad all over the world. His Scots in the USA and Canada records details about Scottish immigrants who came to the US and Canada during the mid to later 19th century. Dobson extracted this information primarily from newspaper accounts, as well as archival documents such as passenger records. Entries may include other details about your family members and relationships, marriage places, religious or professional affiliations, ship names, and similar facts. 35 of these volumes are searchable on Ancestry, including Scots in the USA and Canada, 1825 to 1875, and Scots in Georgia and the Deep South. All of Dobson's books are also available in the BYU library, as well as the main family history library in Salt Lake City. So if you want to search the books themselves, they are available at our family history library. And I have put a link to the BYU catalog under that title, looking for Dobson's volumes, in my handout. So you can look at which ones might be interesting to you and then come on into the library and check them out. All right, Canada. By 1763, all of Eastern Canada was controlled by the British, and settlement then spread westward. The Confederation of the Colonies of Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, Lower Canada, which is now Quebec, and Nova Scotia, which is New Scotland, and New Brunswick took place in 1867. Further areas joined gradually, with the last colonies, Newfoundland and Labrador, joining in 1949. Canada now has 10 provinces and 3 territories. And if you know which province or territory your ancestor lived, you'll get the most out of these sources. So emigration to Canada by Europeans was started by the French in 1604, and the charter for the first Scottish colony was granted to Sir William Alexander as early as 1621, with the first permanent settlements from 1629 in the Nova Scotia area. So if you have Canadian ancestry, they might very well be Scottish. So that's an important clue as you are searching your records. So roughly 500,000 people emigrated to Canada from Great Britain in the 1800s. And most of the Scottish immigrants were settling in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Ontario. So kind of more that eastern side of Canada. As far as sources for Canadian immigration records, you've got the citizen registration records of the Montreal Circuit Court. And these are from the mid 1800s to mid 1900s. And there's more than 8,000 files created by the Circuit Court office in Montreal about people who were applying for citizenship to Canada. Some of these files are for people who applied or who were born in Canada or Great Britain and became American citizens later. So you've got so much movement going on here. This is where things can get really tricky. But people born in Canada were considered British subjects, but immigrants born in Great Britain and the Commonwealth were already British subjects and did not need to apply for citizenship in Canada. So if you know your people came over from the British Isles, they are probably not going to be listed in these citizenship records. But if they came from other places besides Britain, you may find them here. Canadian immigrants before 1865 includes passenger lists and other records about early Canadian immigrants and settlers. This database includes about 28,000 records and is searchable by name. And about 2,000 of this database has entries that are linked to digitized images, which is fantastic. There's also, there was a big surge of immigrants to Canada who were porters and domestics. And during the 19th and early 20th century, Canada was actively recruiting 3 classes of immigrants. So we had the farmers that we talked about before, agricultural workers, and domestic servants, including porters, which is a person employed to carry luggage, in case you weren't sure of that term. The demand for urban and rural household help could not be met within Canada. So the government developed an immigration policy intended to draw suitable British single women ages 17 to 35 to come on over to Canada for jobs. So this had a major impact on women entering the country as domestics. So before the First World War, 75% of these were from the British Isles. In 1904, 2,523 women entered Canada as domestics, and this figure continued to rise past 4,000 and even higher until the beginning of the Depression in 1929. So Library and Archives Canada holds many series of these records regarding the domestics sent to Canada, and these are described in the guide Records on the Immigration of Domestics. And these are super great resources for searching the women in your line. Passenger lists from the British Parliament legislation regulated vessels carrying immigrants to North America. So the master of the vessel was required to prepare a list of passengers and to deposit it at the port of departure. So you've got the records wherever they came from on that side. And but there aren't comprehensive lists of these for before 1865. Unfortunately, few of those lists have survived. But once you get past 1865, you can find these immigration records in the Library and Archives Canada, and as well as, the passenger lists are the sole surviving official records of the arrival of the majority of people accepted as immigrants in Canada. So these passenger lists can have some really helpful information. They'll have the name of the ship, the port and date of departure where it came from, which is like the most important for connecting it back to the old world, and its port and date of arrival in Canada. So you'll get name, age, sex, profession or occupation, nationality, and destination of each passenger aboard. In some of the earlier manifests, personal information is omitted for wives, minor children, groups of laborers, and first and second class passengers. But depending on the date, some lists can contain a wealth of information on immigrants, such as their health, religion, previous visits to Canada, family relationships, and cash on hand. Also in Canada, you can look in the Library and Archives Canada, and where you'll find the following online databases. You've got the Immigrants to Canada for pre-1865, what is there. You've got declarations of aliens and Irish orphans, previously known as the Miscellaneous Immigration Index. You also have on Ancestry passenger lists from 1865 to 1922. Unfortunately, not searchable by name here, but by ship name, port, and dates of departure and arrival. So if you know the approximate dates of departure of your ancestors coming into Canada, you can try and find the ship by those dates. And then you've also got lists of border crossings to and from the United States. And these records are searchable by name and include images of the records. There's also a website called Ingenies, which has made available the Miscellaneous Immigration Index, including information from a card index of names of immigrants from the British Isles to Quebec and Ontario. This includes approximately 15,000 names, and a list of sources is also provided. So you'll get a brief description of the information that can be found in those records. All right, lastly, we are going to talk about our records here in the United States of the Scottish immigrants coming in here. So when the USA gained independence from Great Britain, most of its resident immigrants obviously had come from Northern Europe. But in the 1800s, about 50 million people arrived to settle in the United States. That's a lot of people. Most of them came from Britain, Ireland, and Germany. And after the Civil War, there followed a period of reconstruction across the United States. The Industrial Revolution meant more and more workers were needed, so immigration from the Old World was encouraged. Work was available on the railways being built across the country and in America's myriad factories. At the same time, there was famine in Ireland, economic troubles in Scotland, and revolutions and problems in other European countries, which drove people from their homelands. British and German companies began to operate steamships across the Atlantic, making the journey to America much quicker. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was the most powerful industrial nation in the world. As the 20th century dawned, the population of the United States became more diverse as the origins of American immigrants widened to include Eastern and Southern Europe. In 1892, Ellis Island opened, which you've all heard of, and between 1892 and 1953, more than 12 million immigrants were processed and set on the path to become American citizens from this location, where the Statue of Liberty now stands. And searching these immigration records are of major importance when you have United States ancestry, especially coming over from Scotland. It's been a major concern to locate, transcribe, and make available these ship passenger lists and other records. But thankfully, much of this information is finally now available online. The U.S. National Archives has passenger arrival records, sometimes called ship passenger lists, for arrivals to the United States from foreign ports between approximately 1820 and 1982, with some gaps. But these records are arranged by port or airport of arrival. So passenger arrival records may provide you with information such as nationality, place of birth, ship name, date of entry to the United States, age, height, eye and hair color, profession, place of last residence, name and address of the relatives they're joining in the United States, and the amount of money they are carrying, plus maybe some other little tidbits. So these are really fun for getting some insight into the situation of the immigrants as they came. The NIS or the INS, or the Immigration and Naturalization Service, had paper records originally, and unfortunately they were not retained, but they were put onto microfilm reels, which are now in the custody of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And these are all copies, since the original paper records don't exist. And due to the fragile nature of these original microfilms, access to these is limited until it can be transferred to a more suitable format. But the National Archives is in the process of transferring the microfilm to a digital format, and all digitized copies will eventually be available online via the National Archives catalog. Keep in mind that arrival records are restricted due to personally identifiable information for 75 years. So you must request them, the more recent ones, through the Freedom of Information Act request. Let's see. So even though there were a lot of these that aren't digitized yet, there are quite a few that have been digitized by the National Archives partners, which include Ancestry.com, Fold3.com, and FamilySearch.org. These sites have digitized microfilm publications and original records from the National Archives holdings, and they're available on their websites. And as discussed, these records are continuously being microfilmed, and they're in the process of being digitized. So if you're stuck somewhere and you want to go about searching other lines for a while, keep checking back, because you never know when the records of your ancestors are going to show up, and it can be a really exciting day. The big one is Ellis Island, where there is the American Family Immigration History Center database. So this is home to a vast archive of immigrants. The database from 1892 to 1924 contains over 65 million searchable records. This gives us the opportunity to examine immigration documents, find connections to ancestry and heritage, and you can even offer your own contributions to these records. There's family stories and all sorts of things in these databases. So this is accessible in two places. You can go in person to the Family History Center at Ellis Island and visit or you could visit the foundation's website. I was over there the year before the pandemic hit, November of 2019, and I wanted so badly to go over there to Ellis Island, but unfortunately there was a terrible snowstorm and I was unable to get out there. So maybe go when the weather's a little bit better. But you can search these on the website as well. The Family History Center itself is open daily, and they have research assistants available to answer questions. They do have some nominal fees to aid in the support of the center. All these records are free to search online, and you can search by name or ship to view a digitized version of the passenger lists. And often you can see a picture of the ship itself, which is really interesting. So you just have to create a free user account to view your search results. If you need help getting started on any of this, one thing that's really helpful is that you can become a member of the Ellis Island American Family Immigration Center. If you're a member at the voyage level and above, you get one dedicated passenger search session with a professional. These experts will help you begin your genealogical journey with a virtual or remote research session. So there is a membership page that I've linked to in the handout that you can check that out if that sounds like something that would be helpful to you. And then lastly, it's important to keep in mind the UK outbound passenger lists on the other side of the ocean, which include passengers bound for the United States. Though, as discussed, we'll often find more information on the immigration inside than the emigrating outside side. But it's always great if you can find your ancestors on both sides. As the 1820s and the mid 1800s went through, recording these immigrants became more and more regular. And so there's lots of records available for most ports with custom houses. Lists for the earlier period do not usually include children's names, but later ones do. There are passenger and immigration list database on Ancestry and other providers. So it's often the case that you will find evidence of immigration from a country, first of all, by finding it in census records where the country of origin was written down, but you can't find any trace of your person in any of these passenger lists. So as I've been talking about this, you've probably been able to see that it's very hit and miss sometimes of whether or not your ancestors were recorded in these lists. There were known issues with preservation, including a fire at Ellis Immigration Center in 1897, which destroyed a great number of state and federal records. But you can build a clear picture of the likely time of immigration to the United States through other records if you can't find the actual passenger list. The records that will help you the most with this are census records and naturalization records when the immigrants applied to become citizens. So some of these sources that you can find are Passenger and Immigration List Index, which include immigrants to the US and Canada, and most surviving pre-1820 lists are indexed. So these are available via Ancestry and in print format. There's also the New York passenger lists from 1820 to 1957 via Ancestry and Find My Past, and Family Search has some of these as well. So these are kind of your main three, the big three when you're searching for immigrants. However, keep in mind people came into many other ports, and many of the records can be available online in the same databases. There's also a famine Irish passenger record. And as we discussed, Scottish going to Ireland, searching the Irish coming in also can help you find your Scotch-Irish ancestors. 30% of these people were not actually from Ireland, and on the National Archives access to the archival databases, you can find these. Castle Garden is another resource. It's the first official immigration center in America. It has a database of 11 million names that's still being added to, and this is searchable. There's also border crossings from Canada to the United States, which is a database in and of itself, and you can find these on Ancestry and Family Search. as well as a Immigrant Ships Transcribers Guild that has been trying to transcribe many, many of these records. And you can search their website and see if your ancestors might be there. There's also a book called not a book, a webpage called One Step Web Pages by Steve Morse, which give you a simplified one-step interface to a lot of different databases. So this can be a really great place to look. And they deal with immigration, and they're worth investigating as well. As this book, Mastering Immigration and Naturalization Records by Daniel Quillen. And it covers American records in particular. And then, of course, Ancestry has its Passenger and Immigration Index. So all of these will also be in the handout. As you can see, sometimes searching for your ancestors can be a little bit like searching for a needle in a haystack when you're talking about immigration. It's certainly not as easy as what we talked about with census records, church records, or civil records in Scotland. But on the screen here, you can see floating in all these other places that you can search. And even though it can be difficult sometimes to find your ancestors, it is possible. Just knowing all of these resources and that there's so many different places to look is just a huge, it's like a tool in your toolbox to help you find where you need to go. Now, how do you know which ones to look at? That can be a little bit challenging. But if you look for clues in the records you do have, you can maybe find some information about time periods, which can help you, especially if you want to look through my handout or the Family Search Wiki, some of these other databases and research guides that are available that can, especially on the Scottish Archive Network and the National Records of Scotland, there's lots of guides to help you figure out what time period it might have been, and because of the time period, what types of records you should look in. And keeping in mind that your Scottish ancestors could be from other places in the world. So it's definitely it was a place, kind of a melting pot. America's always called, the United States is always called the melting pot, but definitely there were lots of different nationalities going through the British Isles at this time in history. So I just wish you the best of luck as you're doing this research. Though it can be tricky, it's super rewarding. And I wish you the best of luck with it. And if there's anything I can do to help, my email address is listed in the handout, and I'd love to give you a hand.